that the candidates took the time to come out and meet with them. Because what happens in our south side is, and I've said this, y'all heard me preach it at the Gallego, the ones that were there, our people see candidates when they're running, and they don't see them the rest of the time. And what our organization wants to do is to change that, is to have a pledge from every candidate that once you're elected, you're going to be around the community, and you're not gonna just come around, but you're gonna follow up with people and their needs. So we'll talk more about that later on, but it is 7 o'clock, so it is my pleasure to introduce our next congressman to the 23rd Congressional District, Gallego.
Back here, let me go back here. Here's what I wanted to chat about, and thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to see so many of you here, and including the judge who I served in the legislature with. But here's what I wanted to chat about very quickly, and that's voter ID. And you know, the challenge for us is really making sure that people understand the significance of the changes in the law and what it means. Because what we saw last time, there was a study done by Rice and the University of Houston that shows that it really impacted people in a real way, that a lot of people, they had heard so much about voter ID, and they knew the law had changed, and they had read that Texas had the strictest voter ID law in the country. And so they didn't think that they had the ID necessary to be able to vote, and so they didn't go. And 5 out of 6 of those folks who didn't show up were people who were intending to vote for the Democratic candidate. So when you know that those are the people that we're losing, and the truth is, look, all of us have a very vested interest in keeping the sanctity. None of us want fraud. None of us want to cheat. We all, those of us, you know, who've had kids, we don't teach our kids to do the wrong thing. We teach our kids to do the right thing. But the challenge with this law is that there's only certain forms of ID that are acceptable. I'm teaching right now, and one of the interesting things to me, the law says you have to have a government-issued ID. But one of the government-issued IDs, for example, is a college ID. For all of these kids, UTSA, you know, A&M here, that Senator Madlow is so passionate about, and Senator Uresti now is so passionate about, that's building on the south side. Trinity, Incarnate Word, St. Mary's, so many of these places. You know, a college ID isn't good enough to get you into vote. And so as long as you you need to, you know, people need to understand that, truthfully, we ought to be able to do this. Now, the challenge for me with that law was, if you want to fix the issues of fraud isn't in in-person voting. Nobody ever shows up. There's, I think, maybe one documented instance that I can think of where somebody showed up to vote and they gave the wrong name. Imagine somebody walking up and saying, hey, my name is Pete Gallego, and I want to vote, and they're not Pete Gallego. I mean, that doesn't really happen. Where the fraud has been traditionally is in the mail ballot system, right? But the mail ballot system isn't impacted one way or the other by the voter ID law, because the voter ID law only applies to those people who show up in person to vote, right? So I think part of the challenge is it's the state's job and the Secretary of State's job to tell people when the laws have changed that this is what you need. But frankly, they also have a vested interest many times in making sure that our turnout, you know, if there's a lower turnout, it ain't us that isn't showing up, right? It ain't us so they don't really do a great job of telling people what they need. And as a result, people think they are not eligible, and so they don't go vote. Nothing is worse than going and standing in line and waiting your turn, and then getting up there and finding out, oh, you're not eligible to vote. So people aren't willing to do that. And so what we have to do really in a very real way is make sure that people understand how the law, that they have the forms of ID that they need to have, that we help them get those forms of ID if they don't have them, and that we explain to them all that is necessary, because frankly, you know, this is an issue that I know y'all are here because all of you are passionate about it. But I'm very passionate about it. Because I remember as a little kid, when I was growing up, and in San Antonio and in some places it was also prevalent, in some places it wasn't so prevalent. But when I grew up in segregation, and you were literally discouraged from voting, if you were Latino, and in those days we weren't Latinos, right? We were all Mexican, and that just called us Mexicans. And so if you showed up to vote, sometimes your employer would say, I better not see your name on the list of people who voted, because I don't want you causing any trouble, right? Or they would say, you know, I mean, if you owned a business, like my family did, they wouldn't do business with you if you participated in politics. And so, having grown up, my dad was the first Latino on the school board in Alpine, Texas, and largely led the fight for integration in Alpine. And so I saw all of that as a little kid growing up. I grew up in the middle of that. And I will tell you that nothing really, in terms of our citizenship, is more important than that right to vote. And I take my little boy to vote with me every time that I go on these elections, so that he will see the importance. And I urge all of you to do the same thing with your kids and your grandkids and your nephews and your nieces, because we've got to fix this challenge. The fastest growing part of the population in this state in terms of demographics is the Latino part of the population. But it's also one of the lowest turnout parts of the population. And you know, that doesn't say good things about us, because we're, as American, we've done as much for this country as any other ethnic group out there. And we have a vested interest in this, and I don't want people to think otherwise. And that voter ID law, many times, is aimed at those people, like the Latino community, that have a history of not showing up, because we don't need excuses not to go vote, right? We have enough of those already. I will tell you that one of the challenges for me this last time, some of you may know I had a broken foot during the campaign, and so I couldn't really walk very much. But when I was walking when I was hobbling along during the campaign, I can't tell you how many houses I went to where the lady would say, "Ay, mijo, a mí me gusta ir el día de las elecciones." You know, I like to go vote on election day. I don't really like early voting. And if you have an issue with early voting, we can fix it during that 2-week period of time. It's hard to do anything about it. So if you forget your ID or anything, you lose a person on election day. If we can get them there early, and if we can get them there with the right forms of ID, then that's important. Remember, 5 out of 6 people, according to that study that was done by Rice at U of H, 5 out of 6 people who didn't go vote would have voted for a Democratic candidate. And 5 out of 6 people, now, the other interesting thing is that a lot of these people that didn't go vote, they didn't go vote because they thought they didn't have the right kind of ID. And they did. And they did. So that's the confusion in it. And if we can help spread the word, then I think that makes all the difference. That makes all the difference. So you all are at the front line. I get in trouble for block walking because they tell you that you're only supposed to spend so many minutes at each house, right? And so people will tell me, you know, in 10 minutes we'll meet you at the other end of the block, and well, 10 minutes later I'm still at my first house. So because I love to chat, and I love to hang out, and people invite me in for coffee and tea, and so there I am. But that kind of stuff, that kind of voter engagement, I think is really, really important. There's a voter fatigue in San Antonio right now with all this series of special elections over the course of the last year, and you know, there's a very real possibility that you'll have up to 5 because the candidates in the state rep race. Because right now there will be a runoff, right, who determines who the next state rep is from that district. But as was noted, they also have to run, they have to sign up in November to run in the primary. And I don't know if all of them are going to sign up to run again or not, but if they do, and then there's another runoff, then there's another election, right? And then there's the general election. And so you're going to see a whole series of elections. And the important part is to make sure that in that general election, that we make sure we don't lose that seat ultimately, because that seat has been in Democratic hands for a long time, and it's really an important thing, I think, for some of them. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to chat. Me encanta platicar, sí, señor.
Are you familiar with the provisional ballots?
Yes.
So does anybody oversee the ones that are rejected?
You know, we usually have, we normally have people in there watching and arguing about it, about each of the provisional ballots. Ultimately, those are the election judges' call, but you always, in a close election, you pay particularly close attention to how many of those get thrown out. And the theory was always that you would try to ascertain the voter's intent, and that sometimes is harder to do than at other times, but ultimately, that's why it's so important to have somebody in there watching what's going on. Because if there's an argument about, you know, if my driver's license says, I don't know, 1387 Presa, and I'm registered at 1385 Presa, then they're going to say, oh, that's not really you. And so then they may make you vote a provisional ballot, and you're going to have
they don't count that vote.
Until the end. And in the end, they'll argue about it, and they may kick it out, or they may allow it, but ultimately that's the... ¿Qué más? Yes,
Congressman, I'm assuming that when the national campaign gets rolling, assuming Hillary is the nominee, that they're, unless something unusual happens, they're going to write off Texas for the national ticket. But I'm hoping that you're going to communicate with them to make sure that 23 is always in play, and Hillary Clinton and that crowd coming down in your district could make a big difference in the outcome of that election.
well, I will tell you this. I think the 23rd district is always in play. The way that it was, formed, the way that it was drawn on the map, it will always be in play. And I don't necessarily know that that's a bad thing, because I think it makes everybody work. And I think it makes everybody stick close to home and actually talk to people. And, you know, what I will tell you is that nobody likes, one of the challenges for most Democrats is the Tea Party, right? Because they're so extreme on their end. And we always have to watch that reasonable people always win. Because I will tell you, I mean, just thinking about this in terms of what you teach your kids, because that's how I try to, my life isn't very complicated, right? In Alpine, to be in my office by 8 in the morning, I leave my house at 7:59 and a half. So I don't, I try to look at things in a very simple way. But, you know, the truth is always somewhere in the middle. And when you're teaching your kids about, you don't really teach your kids about these values in the sense of Democrats and Republicans. You really teach your kids about right and wrong, and you let them feel their way through on the issues. Because you want these kids to be morally centered. And I think a candidate needs to be that centered, to be able to distinguish between what's a good idea and a bad idea for the constituents that they serve. And I think that it is a mistake for our country to be at a point where we can't even talk to each other. Because I can tell you that for all of us, we ought to be able to disagree on something and then go eat dinner, right? I mean, that's what happens. I've been here in meetings in this room that we've had, where we've had a spirited conversation, a spirited debate, but then afterwards we all hang out and we get cookies and punch and we all chat about it, right? And I think that's frankly the way that it should be. And that's what I think we ought to strive for. But a lot of times in the current environment, that's not what happens. I will tell you we will get a lot of help. I will tell you there's a lot more interest in this race this year than there was the last time. It hurts my feelings, but it makes me feel good at the same time. That just the other day I stopped. I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, and so I should tell you that Marlene and I have been married for 26 years. The first day of our honeymoon was a tour of the Valverde Regional Memorial Medical Center in Del Rio, Texas. Okay, that was our honeymoon on the first day. And so the other day I was in Del Rio and I stopped by to see the nurses, and they were laughing with me. A couple of them had kids in high school. They had a really bad bus accident when there was a band trip to Florida and the buses overturned. The kids were in the hospital and whatever. And I actually flew over to hang out with the families and the kids. And they were talking to me about that. And they said, ay, mijo, fíjese que we've known you for so long and nunca, pues no sabíamos que nos ibas a necesitar, you know. We didn't know you were going to need us. We've known you forever and you've always won and we just didn't know. And that happens to me everywhere that I go. I ate at a Jim's in San Antonio here 2 days ago, and the person at the cash register says, oh, I'm so sorry. I donated some stuff. In fact, Irma was with me. I donated some stuff at the Goodwill on Zarzamora, and the man there says, he says, ay, mijo, how are things in D.C.? And I said, well, I'm not in D.C. anymore. And he said, no le gustó el trabajo, you didn't like the job, why aren't you? And I had to tell him, and I said, ¿usted votó en esta elección? And he said, no fui a votar. And I said, pues eso fue lo que pasó. You know, that's what happened. The best story I will tell you is I was talking to some of the postal workers, you'll like this story, in Pecos, who, you know, the congressional office sends mail pieces, right? And the best story that I heard, some of the postal workers over there called me, and they were laughing, because a lot of people had returned the mail, the frank mail from the congressman, because they said, we don't know who this is. Our congressman is PKM. And so when you go around in places like that, and you hear those kinds of stories, it really makes you feel good. I think we'll get a lot of national help. And with the turnout, with a lot of work, and a lot of, we're not going to have as much money as the Republicans have ever. That's just not going to be. So we got to do it ourselves.
You mentioned Alpine. My concern has been, I told people, they need to start getting out into the rural areas more, because they seem to concentrate on the cities, and there's a lot of rural. I mean, it adds up, all these little towns, and I think the Democrats over there, I think they might get intimidated. Whereas people from the outside came and back with them, walking or whatever, it might give me more support.
Well, I will tell you that election was 2,400 votes. And of difference, and it is not an exaggeration to say that I have that many cousins, and so it is doable. It is very doable in an election where people turn out, and we've just got to get that. We've got to get that help. We've got to do our own work here, and you know, I feel it. You feel it out there as you walk. You feel it out there as you chat with people. And frankly, Dr. Carson and his interesting views, like on the pyramids, did y'all know that the pyramids were tombs, that they were actually, they're grain silos? And Donald Trump with his comments about, my wife, Nicolas on his mother's side is a 10th generation Texan, because that's a land grant family, that's been a long time. But for me, my grandmother no era ciudadana, you know? And so, and nunca se quiso ser ciudadana. And so, when Donald Trump says a lot of these things, I remember how hard my grandmother worked. And I remember, it's hard to explain to kids now that how you used to wash clothes, by hand, in a I don't know how you say tina in English. How do you say tina? In a wash tub, I guess, and with and all of these kinds of things that I saw, and it's hard for me. It's hard for me to listen to that rhetoric and think about my abuela in the same. ¿Qué más?
My name is Jessica, and I'm a resident here of the Southeast Side, and I also work with
for Saunida and the Vecinos of Mission Trails, and we're starting to work with some other nonprofit organizations because we're looking at, you know, all of the things that y'all have brought up about a lack of will to vote, but also we're also coming across like there's a real lack of understanding on what we're voting on, right? Like this last election, nobody I talked to knew what the first thing about any of those propositions, and then the way the districts are all split up, we're not all voting on the same stuff either. So that's what we're seeing, and you know, as nonprofit and community-based organizations, trying to bridge those gaps. That's one of the things that we're running into, that we've been thinking we really need to connect in a more meaningful way to candidates and people in office to bridge that gap of understanding what it is we're voting for, when, and to really more truly understand the impact. We don't have a solution, but just to that's what we're thinking about.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things is, so I've been teaching, right? I've been teaching at a couple of universities, and I asked my kids about how many of you voted on election day, and I was really surprised at how many of them had voted, because they have this app that's called Turbo Vote that sends them an email about an election in the city that they live in and in the precincts that they live in, how it does that. But apparently in this age of electronics, you can do that. But our challenge is that, you know, a lot of us don't have that. We're not tech savvy, and we're not, you know, and so I don't see a lot of turbo vote people right now going to school on the south side. We need to fix that because for the young kids that do have those cell phones, we need to teach them that there are options out there that will have them. We also need to work, frankly, on those of you who know school board members. Did you know that it's a state law that every high school principal is a voter registrar, and once a month he or she is supposed to register every kid in that school who turns 18 that month? That's been a law on the books for a very long time, so that automatically in our high schools, every kid who turns 18 is supposed to be registered to vote at school. And we don't do that. And if we did those kinds of things, and if we told them about, then I think that would make all the difference in the world. Because part of our challenge is that most often people don't know, and if you know, if you have it, then it makes a difference.
Yeah, alongside the Turbo Vote, there's also an app called Ballotpedia, which actually explains and breaks down every proposition, no matter where you're at in the United States. And that's like for, like you said, you mentioned like some people that didn't know what the proposition was all about. That was a great opportunity to like really showcase this app, because it not only does it break down the proposition, it shows who's actually for it, who's against it, and all this other, like who actually drew up the proposition. So like technology is a wonderful tool. It's just a matter of like the congressman said, to get it to the people that actually need it the most.
Well, the issue is always information, and people need to know. I would suggest that we talk about issues that matter to people in terms of, if you have a kid who's fixing to go to college, we can talk about financial aid and student loans and those kinds of things. Because there's some people, you know, there were some votes to cut Pell Grants. And do we really want to cut Pell Grants? You know? There have been some votes to have interest rates that raise with the market conditions. So, I mean, if you have a house, a mortgage on your house, you get a fixed rate, right? You can get a fixed rate for 20 years. But if you have a student loan, would you want a student loan that if the interest rates go up to 15 or 20%, you're suddenly paying interest of 15 to 20%? No, you don't want that. You want a fixed rate. That, I will tell you that education is the single most powerful way to change a person's life. Right? And I'm living proof. I mean, I grew up in a restaurant washing dishes, and so if we talk about those issues that matter in very simple terms, I think it makes a difference at getting people out. But you have to have a conversation with every single person at every single door. And that's the hard part. It was easy for me in the legislature where you have 160 or 170,000 people to do a better, when you have 800,000 people in a congressional district, it's hard to meet everybody and talk to everybody. And that's the challenge. That's why it takes everybody working together to do this. So. Anything else?
We as letter carriers, we've done it in Oregon and we're doing it in Florida. We're going to try to do it here in the state of Texas, is try to change the laws that vote by mail should be implemented instead of just vote by machines. So it's working in Florida and it's working in Oregon. So we're going to do it here. We already got the language to propose, and hopefully some of these senators guys will go up there and help us put it in there. So I believe that will raise the votes.
You mean for everybody? Or
everyone, not just 65 and over. Right now, early voting is for 65 and older. I believe that's a discrimination to all people.
Or disabled.
Or disabled, right. Or if you're out of the country or military.
And the part, as you said about the vote by mail, there's nothing, no showing of any ID or anything.
That's right.
All they need is when it gets up there that the signatures match. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have ballot board representatives that are there to help when they're making that decision, if it is in fact a signature or not. And so, but that's a good selling point that I know we use when I'm calling people, that it's much easier to go by mail. You won't have to worry about it.
Well, I will tell you, I would love, at some point, we've always argued for same-day voter registration. Imagine what would happen if you could just go to vote that same day, and you could get everybody to participate. Because our challenge is we register a lot of people, but we register a lot of people who don't show up to vote. All right? And so if you could do that same-day voter registration, I think it would make a big difference. There's certain things, at some point, probably not necessarily in the next 15 or 20 years, but at some point you're going to see, I think, internet voting. You're already seeing it in different places, and at some point that's going to be a more widespread, and so it's changing, and we just have to make sure that the folks in our neighborhoods, because a lot of times we're the last ones to get the progress. We're the last ones to get the development issue between the south side and the north side is a great example of the differences that you get, the rural and the urban. And so we just have to make sure that we're out there making noise, reminding people that we're there, and so when those changes come along, that we're included, and we have as much access as everybody else does. Yes, ma'am?
I've been doing voters on Tuesdays at the courthouse, and some people have said that, what's it where you get your license, the Department of Safety?
Public safety.
Yeah, they're supposed to help them with the voter registration, but they're not following through. Who can we talk to about that? The local Jackie Kellerman's office?
Yeah, the elections administrator, or frankly, any one of the state legislators.
Yeah, because we've had several that come to us and they said about a month ago over that. Well, why apply to so-and-so? They said they were going to do that. I didn't get it. It's already been 60 days. They're not following.
Anything else? Me encanta estar aquí con ustedes. Yes, sir. You have a question?
The gerrymandering, is anything going to be done to change it?
I don't know.
We're not in
There's a lot of states are going to a bipartisan commission. California actually did a really interesting system called the jungle primary, where the two top vote getters go to the automatically. Everybody runs in one election: Republicans, Democrats, Independents, everybody. And the top two candidates go on to the general election. So sometimes it's a Democrat and a Republican, sometimes it's two Democrats, sometimes it's two Republicans. But the general election always has two candidates, and it's just the two people that got the most votes in the primary. I will tell you that in Texas, the district, all of the congressional map is still in litigation. There's a 3-judge panel in San Antonio that theoretically will be issuing a decision soon. The lawyer in me would never say this to a judge, but the lawyers have a joke about federal judges, and lawyers talk about it when they say, what's the only difference between God and a federal judge? And the answer is that God doesn't think he's a federal judge. Right? And so we will wait and see whatever the federal judges do and whenever they do it to see what happens with the map. I think there's some really interesting things that the Supreme Court has really lately has come down on our side on things. And so there's email, for example. We know that what the legislature did was they deliberately went out, and with computers now you can do this, they looked for pockets of Latinos that had a high history of turnout, and they drew them out of the 23rd. And they looked for pockets of Latinos that had a very low history of turnout, and they put them in. So that if you look at the demographics of the district, it still looks like a Latino district, right? But if you do it by turnout, then it's a different result. And so, you know, in that sense, you know, that's one of the things that the court has, that they're going to have to decide, was that a fair way, was that a legal way to draw the map.
And this is also the 2010 census?
So we're going to be in 2016, and we'll be halfway to the next map drawing, and we still haven't settled the map from the first one. Alright? And so that's the unbelievable part, but that's the state of that's the state of affairs. So. Anything else? I love coming to hang out. Thank y'all so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. Okay, so we have a few more things. So we didn't take the vote, Gloria reminded me. We didn't take the vote